I found a missing person notice from 1963 with my real grandfather's name. That was the day I realized my whole family was built on a secret. My dad's hands always shook when he tried to open the old cedar chest in our attic. He'd fumble with the key, mutter something about dust allergies, and then every single time, he'd change his mind and say we'd look through it next time. I used to think he was just sentimental, or maybe a little bit of a hoarder. But now, I can't stop replaying those moments, wondering what he was really hiding from me, or maybe from himself. I guess I should say, I'm not the kind of person who's obsessed with ancestry charts or DNA kits. I never cared about tracing my roots back to some medieval village or whatever. But there's this weird thing that happens when you grow up in a family where everyone seems to be reading from a script, and you're the only one who doesn't know their lines. It's like, you start to notice the pauses, the things people don't say. The way my aunt would always change the subject if I asked about my grandfather, or how my grandma's eyes would glaze over when I brought up old photos. The first time I realized something was off, I was maybe 12. My dad and I were cleaning out the garage, and I found this faded black and white photo wedged behind a box of Christmas lights. It was a man I didn't recognize, standing next to my grandmother, both of them looking stiff and formal, like they were posing for a mugshot instead of a family portrait. I asked my dad who he was, and he just said, "That's your grandpa before you were born." And then he took the photo and shoved it in his back pocket. I didn't see it again for years. I let it go, mostly because I was a kid and I figured adults just had their reasons for being weird. But the older I got, the more I started to notice the cracks. Like, my dad never talked about his childhood. Not in the way other people do, with funny stories or embarrassing moments. He'd just say, "It was a different time," and leave it at that. My grandma, too, she'd tell stories about her garden, her neighbors, her church friends, but never about her husband. It was like he'd been erased, or maybe he'd never really existed at all. It wasn't until last year, after my grandma died, that things really started to unravel. We were cleaning out her house, sorting through decades of knickknacks and yellowed letters, when I found the cedar chest again. This time, my dad didn't try to stop me. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands while I opened it. Inside, there were the usual things: old quilts, a stack of birthday cards, a bundle of dried flowers tied with a ribbon. But at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a stack of letters. They were addressed to my grandmother, but the return address was from someone I'd never heard of, James L. Carter. The handwriting was shaky, almost desperate. I glanced at my dad, but he just shook his head like he couldn't bring himself to look. I read the first letter right there, sitting cross-legged on the floor. It was dated 1962. The words were messy, full of apologies and half-explained regrets. "I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant for things to go this way. Please tell Tommy I love him, even if he never knows the truth." Tommy is my dad's name. I felt this cold, prickly feeling crawl up my spine. I read another letter, and another. They all sounded the same: guilt, fear, love, and something else I couldn't quite name. Not once did he call himself dad, or husband. Just James. I looked up at my dad, and he finally met my eyes. He looked so tired, older than I'd ever seen him. "He wasn't my father," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not really. He was someone else. Someone who left." I wanted to ask a million questions, but I couldn't get any of them out. My dad just kept talking, like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to ask. "After James left, your grandma was alone. She had me, but she couldn't do it by herself. That's when Frank stepped in. He was a friend of the family. He married her, raised me like his own. But everyone just pretended. It was easier that way. I don't know what I expected to feel. Anger? Betrayal? Relief? Instead, I just felt hollow, like the floor had dropped out from under me. My whole life, I'd pictured this invisible man, my grandfather, as some kind of ghost haunting the edges of our family. But now I realized he was just a man who'd made a mistake, or maybe a series of them, and then disappeared. After that, I started digging. I couldn't help myself. I went through every box, every photo album, every letter I could find. I started asking questions, quietly at first, then more directly. My aunt clammed up, my uncle got angry, but my dad just let me. I think he wanted me to know, even if it hurt. The more I found, the less I understood. There were gaps everywhere, missing years, photos with faces scratched out, stories that didn't add up. I found a newspaper clipping from 1963 about a man named James Carter who'd gone missing after a domestic dispute. No body was ever found. The article was short, almost dismissive, but it felt like a punch to the gut. Was that my real grandfather? Did my family know what happened to him? Did they care? I started to feel like I was living in someone else's life. Like my own history was a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the ones I did have didn't fit together. I'd lie awake at night, replaying conversations, trying to remember every detail, every slip of the tongue. I started to wonder if I even wanted to know the truth, or if I was just chasing ghosts. But I couldn't stop. Not after everything I'd found. Not after seeing the way my dad looked at those letters, like they were both a lifeline and a curse. After that night, I started carrying the letters around with me, tucked into a battered notebook I kept in my backpack. I'd read them on the bus, in the break room at work, sometimes just sitting in my car with the engine off, letting the words blur together until I couldn't tell if I was angry or just tired. I kept thinking there'd be some kind of answer hidden in the margins, some clue that would make everything make sense. But all I found was more confusion. I started calling my dad more often, sometimes just to hear his voice. He never brought up the letters, but he didn't have to. There was this heaviness between us, like we were both tiptoeing around a hole in the floor. Sometimes I'd ask him about James, and he'd get this faraway look, like he was trying to remember a dream he'd had as a kid. He was tall, he said once. Always wore a hat, even inside. Smelled like cigarettes and Old Spice. Then he'd go quiet, and I'd hear him breathing on the other end of the line, like he was waiting for me to say something that would make it all okay. I started piecing together what little I could. James Carter, my biological grandfather, had married my grandmother in 1959. My dad was born a year later. There were a few photos of them together, always stiff and formal, never smiling. Then, in 1963, James disappeared. The official story was that he'd left after a fight, but nobody ever talked about what the fight was about. My grandma remarried a year later to Frank, the man I'd always called Grandpa. Frank was in all the family photos after that, smiling, holding my dad on his lap, looking for all the world like he belonged there. But the more I dug, the more I realized how much everyone had to lose if the truth ever came out. My family was the kind of family that cared about appearances. Church every Sunday, potlucks, Christmas cards with matching sweaters. My grandma was a pillar of the community, the kind of woman who baked pies for the neighbors and never missed a PDA meeting. I started to wonder what it must have cost her to keep all those secrets, to pretend that everything was fine when it so obviously wasn't. I tried talking to my aunt again, hoping she'd open up now that Grandma was gone. She just shook her head, eyes darting away. "Let it go," she said. "It's not worth digging up old bones." But I couldn't. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of all the things nobody would say. One night, I drove out to the old house where my dad grew up. It was empty now, the windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the porch where my dad must have played as a kid, wondering what it must have been like to grow up in a house full of ghosts. I thought about breaking in just to see if there was anything left inside. Some scrap of paper, a forgotten photograph, anything that might tell me who James Carter really was. But I couldn't do it. I just sat there, listening to the cicadas, feeling like I was trespassing on someone else's life. The next day, I called my dad and asked him if he remembered the night James disappeared. There was a long pause, and then he said, "I remember yelling. I remember Mom crying. I remember Frank showing up the next morning with a bag of groceries, like nothing had happened." He sounded so small, like a kid again. Nobody ever told me what really happened. I just learned not to ask. I started to wonder if maybe that was the real secret, not what happened to James, but the way everyone learned to live with not knowing. The way silence became a kind of inheritance, passed down from one generation to the next. But I couldn't let it go. I started looking up old newspaper archives, digging through public records, anything I could find. Most of it was dead ends, missing person reports, a few vague mentions in the local paper, nothing concrete. But then I found something that made my stomach drop. A police report from 1963, filed by my grandmother. It was short, just a few lines, but it said James had been acting erratically and threatened harm. There was a note in the margin. No further action taken. I stared at the report for a long time, trying to imagine my grandmother, so composed, so careful, writing those words. I wondered if she was scared or angry, or just desperate to make it all go away. I wondered if Frank had been there that night, if he'd helped her, if he'd done something he could never take back. I started having dreams about James. In the dreams, he was always standing just out of reach, his face blurred, his voice muffled. Sometimes he'd try to tell me something, but I could never make out the words. I'd wake up sweating, heart racing, feeling like I'd lost something I never really had. I started to realize that maybe I'd never get the answers I wanted. Maybe the truth was buried too deep, tangled up in all the lies and half-truths my family had told themselves for decades. But I couldn't stop looking. I felt like if I stopped, I'd disappear too. Just another ghost in a house full of secrets. One night, I called my dad again just to hear his voice. He sounded tired, but lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. "You know," he said, "Frank wasn't a bad man. He did his best. He loved us in his own way." There was a pause, and then he said, "But I still wonder sometimes. What if James had stayed? What kind of person would I be?" I didn't know what to say. I still don't. All I know is that the more I learn, the less I understand. But I can't stop searching. Not yet. A few weeks after that last call with my dad, I found myself driving out to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. I don't know what I was hoping for, maybe some kind of sign, or just a place to sit with the weight of everything I'd learned. The sky was gray, the kind of heavy, low-hanging gray that makes everything feel quieter than it should. I sat on the cold stone bench near her grave, the letters in my lap, and tried to picture her as a young woman, before all the secrets, before the lies. I kept thinking about that police report. The way it was so brief, so clinical. No further action taken. I wondered if that was the moment the story ended for James, or if it was just the beginning of a different kind of disappearance. I wondered if my grandmother had ever told Frank the whole truth, or if she'd just let him believe whatever he needed to believe to stay. I wondered if my dad had ever really stopped waiting for his father to come back. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I opened the letters again. I read them all, one after another, until the words started to blur together. There was one I hadn't noticed before, tucked at the very bottom of the stack. It was shorter than the others, written in a different hand, shakier, almost frantic. It wasn't signed James. It was just a single line. I'm sorry for what I did. Please forgive me. I stared at that line for a long time, trying to imagine what could have driven someone to write it. What had he done? What was he asking forgiveness for? I thought about all the things that go unsaid in families, all the ways we try to protect each other by hiding the truth. I wondered if maybe the real secret wasn't what happened to James, but the way everyone had learned to live with not knowing. I started to realize that maybe I'd never get the answers I wanted. Maybe the truth was buried too deep, tangled up in all the lies and half-truths my family had told themselves for decades. But I couldn't stop looking. I felt like if I stopped, I'd disappear too, just another ghost in a house full of secrets. A few days later, I got a call from my uncle. He sounded nervous, like he was about to confess to a crime. I heard you've been asking questions, he said. About James. I braced myself, expecting him to tell me to drop it, to let the past stay buried. But instead, he sighed. I was just a kid, but I remember that night. There was shouting. Mom was crying. Frank was there, trying to calm everyone down. Then James left. I never saw him again. He paused, and I could hear him breathing, slow and shaky. I always thought he'd come back. I used to watch the road, waiting for his car. But he never did. After a while, we just stopped talking about him. It was easier that way. I thanked him, not sure what else to say. I hung up and sat in the dark, the phone still warm in my hand. I thought about all the ways families rewrite their own histories, all the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the things we can't explain. I wondered if maybe the truth wasn't as important as I thought it was. Maybe what mattered was the way we carried those secrets, the way we tried to protect each other, even when it hurt. I started to let go just a little. I stopped looking for answers in old newspapers and police reports. I started asking my dad about Frank instead, about the man who raised him, who taught him how to ride a bike, who showed up when James didn't. My dad started telling stories I'd never heard before, about fishing trips and Sunday mornings, and the way Frank used to sing off-key in the car. I realized that maybe Frank wasn't my biological grandfather, but he was the one who stayed. The one who chose us. Sometimes I still think about James. I wonder if he ever found peace, wherever he ended up. I wonder if he ever thought about the family he left behind, or if he just kept running, trying to outrun the weight of his own mistakes. I wonder if I'll ever really know what happened to him, or if that's just another story I'll have to learn to live without. But I'm starting to understand that maybe that's okay. Maybe families are just a collection of stories, some true, some half-remembered, some we tell ourselves to make the world a little less lonely. Maybe the real treasure isn't the truth, but the way we keep searching for it, even when we know we'll never find all the answers. I still keep the letters, tucked away in the cedar chest. Sometimes I take them out and read them, just to remind myself that the past is never as simple as we want it to be. Sometimes I think about burning them, letting the secrets go up in smoke. But I never do. I guess I'm not ready to let go. Not completely. Maybe I never will.